plenty. Remember, too, Hoover knew that the Bushes were Nazis. The biggest American Nazis, the ones who supported and employed Prescott Bush, were not Hoover's friends. He had busted them in 1942, and now they had set up his most important undercover informant for the murder of the president. But so now, with all that in mind, look at this bombshell that Hoover dropped on the Bushes 5 days after the assassination. It was released by the FBI in 1977, hidden under a pile 100,000 pages high. It took 15 years for researchers to find it. It was never classified and would have been widely distributed, so Hoover's not speaking frankly here. We have to read between the lines. It's signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, and the title is Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. That's a big hint, I think, as to what the memo is about. It says that it's about a meeting that took place between the FBI and the CIA the day after the assassination. The memo says that the FBI had been investigating a possible threat from what Hoover calls a misguided anti-Castro group. A misguided anti-Castro group? The memo doesn't say that members of some misguided anti-Castro group killed Kennedy, but Hoover undoubtedly knew that they had. What the memo does do is name Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency as a CIA officer associated with the CIA's misguided anti-Castro groups. It suggests that Bush was the person at CIA responsible for these people. And in stark black and white, it says that the CIA sent Mr. George Bush to Washington the day after the assassination to answer for them, when the FBI had questions about the activities of some misguided anti-Castro group. The memo was a scandal when it was made public in 1988, because it says that George Bush was in the CIA in 1963. It means that Bush lied, committed perjury when he told the Senate under oath that he had no CIA experience before becoming director in 1974. It means that he was in the CIA when he ran for Senate and lost in 1964, and when he ran for Senate and lost in 1970. And it means that he was in the CIA when Nixon brought Bush into the White House, trailing E. Howard Hunt behind him. Bush was first confronted with his memo in 1992, and he had a chance to respond to it. Bush claimed that the memo must be talking about another George Bush working at CIA because it couldn't be talking about him, because he had never been in the CIA. Oh, except for that time in 1974 when he was director of CIA. Should we believe him? Let's make clear what we're talking about here. The George Bush of this memo, who received the FBI's report on misguided anti-Castro Cubans, was an officer in the CIA and obviously a supervisor of the CIA's misguided Cuban operations. We've not only seen the CIA and their misguided Cubans implicated in the Kennedy assassination, but we've seen that Hoover knew that they were involved when he wrote this memo. This is some important stuff, eh? The George Bush of this memo is essentially being named by Hoover as being directly implicated in the assassination. It makes a huge difference if this was our George Bush or some other George Bush. But how can we know? Well, come on, it's basic stuff. Is there any corroboration? Is there any other evidence besides this memo to show whether Bush was in the CIA at this time or shows whether Bush was supervising anti-Castro Cubans? We'll start by looking at Bush's connections. A quick look at Allen Dulles may help us understand the importance of connections. Dulles worked closely with Nazi bankers during World War II. That somehow qualified him to become the director of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. He was the architect of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. When he launched the invasion against Kennedy's orders, of course Kennedy fired him. So thinking people were shocked when he was virtually put in charge of the investigation of Kennedy's murder, the Warren Commission, because he was so widely suspected to have been the leader of the assassins. But he had been fired. He was no longer the head of CIA. How could he lead anything? Because the organizing principle of secret work is that you trust only the people known to you personally and that are connected to you personally. The CIA is not so much an organization as a community, so that it hardly mattered that Kennedy had fired Dulles. The men who were loyal to Dulles, who knew him and trusted him, continued to trust and obey. In fact, Dulles stood at the center of a group of men who not only had the motive to kill the president, but who alone had the ability to steal the body from the Dallas coroner, to steal it from the Secret Service and mutilate it and return it, and to order the media to lie about it for the next 40 years. Was George Bush a member of this community in 1963, as the Hoover memo says? We will never find a CIA document naming the CIA officer who supervised the assassination. That memo doesn't exist. In fact, that person is probably not even listed on the CIA payroll because it's a secret. But what we're looking for is evidence of Bush's presence inside this intelligence community. Did he have close personal ties with these people? That's the real question. Certainly, one of Bush's main ties to this community is the connection between his father and Allen Dulles. In the 1930s and 1940s, Allen Dulles was a close business associate on a first-name basis with both Prescott Bush and Averell Harriman. At the end of World War I, before there was a CIA, Prescott worked with Army intelligence, a forerunner and parallel organization to the CIA. Prescott had the intelligence background, not Dulles, but on paper at least, Dulles was head of the CIA. Through Prescott's closest associate, Averell Harriman, Prescott is also tied to Richard Bissell, the CIA Director of Operations for the Bay of Pigs invasion, who was also fired by Kennedy. Bissell, like Hunt, also worked for Averell Harriman for 10 years before joining the CIA. In 1962, the year before Kennedy was murdered, Prescott also partnered with William Casey, who would become the CIA director under Reagan. At that time, Kennedy was moving to dismantle the CIA. Prescott and Casey together founded the National Strategy Information Center to directly fight against Kennedy's efforts. Now, let's pause for a moment to savor this picture, if you will. We're looking at Prescott, teamed up with a man who would become one of the most notorious law-breaking CIA chiefs in history. Under Reagan, Casey was at the epicenter of the October Surprise/Iran-Contra/crack cocaine scandal. And a year before the assassination, these two formed this National Strategy Information Center to organize opposition to Kennedy's efforts to reduce the power of the CIA. To organize opposition. Think for a moment, what does that mean, to organize opposition? It means that you meet with all the most powerful people you can find, other people who, like you, want to stop Kennedy. And you try to come up with plans to stop him. That's what organizing opposition means, isn't it? The killers would be the most natural candidates for membership in Prescott's organization. Now, this is only circumstantial evidence, but it is powerful circumstantial evidence. And if we pause for another moment to catch up on our scorekeeping, we will see that it has already been shown that Prescott did in fact surround himself with people, including his son, who were directly connected to the killers. He was closely connected to Harriman, who was closely connected to Hunt, a second-degree connection. He was closely connected to Nixon, who was closely connected to Hunt, another second-degree connection. Hunt was in the CIA. That means he also worked for Dulles, so add one more second-degree connection with Hunt. And Hunt was supervised by Richard Bissell at the Bay of Pigs, so add a third-degree connection with Hunt. And of course we have the Hoover memo, which says, in black and white, in so many words, that there is a direct, first-degree connection between Prescott's son, George Bush, and the misguided anti-Castro Cubans who were famously supervised directly by E. Howard Hunt. But at the center of Bush's connections to the world of secret murder and filth is his membership in the Secret Society of Skull and Bones, a secret Yale fraternity famous for its celebration of racism, robbery, and death. This tomb is where they meet twice a week to engage in black rituals involving skulls, candles, and secret oaths. It's supposed to unite the members in a special, creepy way. Brothers under the skin is how the Bonesmen themselves describe their relationship. Their graduates are a powerful bunch of devils. Averell Harriman and Prescott Bush were Bonesmen. George Herbert Walker Bush was a Bonesman, and so was his grandfather, the arch-racist George Herbert Walker. Robert Lovett, architect of the CIA, was a Bonesman, selected for membership by Prescott himself. F. Truby Davison was also selected for membership in 1918, the year that Prescott did the picking. Davison was in charge of hiring for the CIA in 1948, the year that George Herbert Walker Bush left Yale in search of a job. Davison had a son, Endicott Peabody Davison. Endicott was Skull and Bones, class of '48, making him brother under the skin to George Herbert Walker Bush. He's also the Bush family lawyer. Okay, they're weird and creepy. Or not. Maybe in 1,000 years this secret male bonding will be a mainstream practice in group therapy. I don't know. Maybe they don't do it anymore. Maybe they never did it. I don't really care. It's not the point. The point is that no one will dispute the fact that Skull and Bones is an intimate organization whose members have very close relationships with each other, who work with each other throughout the rest of their lives, and who are very loyal to each other. Prescott chose Truby. He had a close relationship with him. Truby went on to become the head of hiring for CIA. George Sr. was a brother under the skin to Truby's son. George Sr. had a close, even intimate relationship with the son of the head of hiring for CIA. Their fathers had a close, even intimate relationship. What we are supposed to be doing here is trying to evaluate this message from Hoover. We are trying to judge the likelihood that this memo, referring to a CIA supervisor of anti-Castro Cubans named George Bush, is referring to our George Bush. Certainly, all this evidence about Skull and Bones and the CIA makes it certainly appear very possible, even likely. In a world where personal connection is everything, no one could possibly have a closer personal relationship to the head of hiring for CIA than George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush's first job on leaving Skull and Bones was to work for Neil Mallon, brother under the skin to Prescott, class of 1918. In a letter to White House aide C.D. Jackson, dated March 26 of 1953, now Senator Prescott Bush described Neil Mallon as a very old and dear friend. I might say that Neil Mallon is well known to Allen Dulles and has tried to be helpful to him at that agency, especially in the procurement of individuals to serve in that important agency. So, George went from Skull and Bones. He went directly from being a brother under the skin to the son of the head of hiring for CIA to working for a recruiter for CIA. You couldn't ask for more powerful evidence that our George Bush was in the CIA when Hoover said that he was. But you can get it. This letter records a meeting between Prescott Bush, George's CIA-promoting father, Neil Mallon, the CIA recruiter, and Allen Dulles, the director of CIA, to discuss, quote, our pilot project in the Caribbean, unquote. Now, let that sink in for a moment. Here you have the two most important men in George's future professional life, his father, Prescott, and the man who trained George in the oil business, Neil Mallon, meeting with the head of the CIA in order to coordinate with the CIA their future plans in the Caribbean. Prescott and Neil Mallon's plans had George at their center. George was their pilot project in the Caribbean. The terrorist raids of Operation 40 involving Hunt, Sturgis, and Marita Lorenz were the CIA's private project in the Caribbean. This letter, then, not only ties George to the CIA, corroborating the Hoover memo on that point, it not only ties George's future oil company to the CIA's plans in the Caribbean, but it thereby ties George to the CIA's misguided anti-Castro groups mentioned in the Hoover memo, which was the CIA's pilot project in the Caribbean. And a short time after this meeting, at the moment that Allen Dulles began implementing his plan for the CIA invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, Bush began his independent business career as